Support for Carolina Business Review is provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. BlueCross BlueShield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. And Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
With now the start of this 8th year in economic expansion, truly one of the longest in the last 140 years, the question is, how will legislative leaders and policy authors craft not what is politically expedient, but what is true to clearly defined and important community priorities? Welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I am Chris William. Will there be bold steps to take advantage of our strong economy and begin to remediate the issues around things like transportation, infrastructure, education? We'll begin there, and later on, the Palmetto State's chief educator returns, the Honorable Molly Spearman.
Major funding also by NOVANT Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by BlueCross and BlueShield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. On this edition of Carolina Business Review, Ted Pitts from the South Carolina Chamber of Commerce, Brian Etheridge of Leadership North Carolina, and special guest Molly Spearman, South Carolina State Superintendent of Education.
Welcome to our program. Brian, good to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Ted, welcome back.
Chris, thanks for having me.
You know, Ted, I want to start with you because it seems like, the economy's good. We've got the 8th year of this expansion. You could argue if it's strong or if it's not, or the jobs recovery or jobless recovery. But nonetheless, we've got an expanding economy. Now would seemingly be the time to make some pretty big bets on these issues that we struggle with here in the region. Transportation is one of them, education. Do we need to do something to take greater advantage of our economic prowess?
You know, if we don't, it's going to hold us back. So South Carolina and North Carolina are both in great states of growth, and a lot of strides are being made on a lot of fronts. The port deepening project down at Charleston, and other things that are occurring around the state with economic development. But our infrastructure and our workforce in South Carolina and really in the Southeast is something that has to be addressed. And specifically, infrastructure in South Carolina has been ignored for too long. And if it's not addressed, it will affect future economic development.
You think the infrastructure and the transportation equation and problem, is that at a tipping point? Would you call it a crisis?
So I think the timing now is, if we don't address it now, I mean, we're in a place where DOT will tell you that roads are going from having to be resurfaced to re-engineered and rebuilt. So the cost continue to go up the longer we wait. And you know, the General Assembly has provided some money, some bonding money that is going to address some of our interstates and some of our bridges, but our secondary system in South Carolina has been neglected for way too long.
Brian, same question. It seems like now's the time to make hay in the summertime when we've got good balance sheet, good income statement on the state level. Wouldn't that make sense?
I echo what we just heard, in that there's a time where we've neglected some things. There's some opportunities to make sure we don't stymie our own growth and to take advantage of the opportunities that are before us and to really help us grow in really proactive ways. And I think there's sometimes make some really calculated investments in our infrastructure and education to help our region continue to grow.
So through the, since we're talking to you, Brian, through the lens of leadership, folks will look at the political debate and dialogue that's going on in not just the state houses and general assemblies, but just in general how we speak to each other, the lack of respect, the lack of tolerance. John F. Kennedy once said, "It's just, remember this thing's on a loop in my head. Don't have just the comfort of opinion without having the discomfort of thought." How do we get to that point as a leadership professional for the politics to maybe fade away a little bit more and have more genuine, authentic discussions about leadership and what that means? How do we get there?
Chris, I think one of the things that has to happen is, to your point, you've got to strip the politics away, and that's awful difficult. But for real leadership and change to happen, it's going to take time. It's not going to be a flip of a switch. You can't like or retweet your way to get there. I think it's going to take citizens who don't agree on the issues being willing to sit down, whether it's a cup of coffee or pick your favorite beverage, but sit down over a cup of coffee and have a conversation about what the other person's hearing, understanding, and coming to it from a sense of understanding what the other person's going through, not just getting your point across. And I think that's one of the first steps.
So Ted, reflect on that a little bit. I mean, you're in the game, man. You're where the rubber meets the road. I mean, you've got to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the way that we communicate today through Twitter and other social media means doesn't lead for a collaborative environment. So you almost, as leaders, they almost have to force themselves to build relationships and sit down and have a conversation with one another and try to work on issues for the good of the people of their state or their country, whatever level they're governing on. So it is a concern. I mean, we see politicians going to Twitter to call people out. You know, that leads to bad blood, which leads to the inability to move things. So I think in South Carolina, at least, we have a lot of leaders that are willing to still sit down and have that direct conversation with folks. And it allows for compromise and it allows for policies to be pushed forward. But politics has become really polar. And in South Carolina, politics has always been a contact sport, but it's come really polar. And you have issues like, you know, the General Assembly draws their own House and Senate districts, and they make them more Republican or more Democrat, depending on which seat you sit in. So there's some things like that I think probably ought to be looked at and see how we can have, you know, representatives actually represent the people of a state as opposed to one separate constituency that in a lot of ways is a minority in certain ways.
Yeah, so redistricting is not unique to South Carolina. Of course, North Carolina goes through that same thing. Ted, how do you, not just at the South Carolina Chamber, but coming out of politics and working for Nikki Haley, I mean, how do you put your arm around someone who's on the, not just the opposite side of an issue, but is oppositional and in an opposite party and say, listen, let's talk about this let's figure out the commonality. How do you become an honest broker and maybe lead the way in that?
So the first thing I think you do is you identify the problem. And if you can't agree on a problem, whether there is a problem or if you both think the problem is from a different area, then that's not going. You're probably not going to find much collaboration. But if you can agree on that there is a problem that we have to address, I think then you can start peeling it back and saying, so what do we agree on that would help address the problem? And when you do that, then you can find some commonality, and then you have to agree to disagree on some things, and you do it in a very respectful manner, and it allows for you to work towards a solution that you both can embrace and support.
Yeah, Brian, how do you best approach that instead of in a general way saying, well, you sit down with a cup of coffee? But I mean, is there a pressure point that you can apply something to here?
I think to Ted's point, you have to start off with, you know, developing a relationship, and to use Ted's illustration of legislators sitting down and working through compromise. Sometimes, so often, the success we see of legislators being able to come to consensus around a really challenging issue is they've got a relationship at the core that they may have worked together in previous roles, in prior experiences, and there's developed a rapport among those folks that transcends the politics. And that's something that they can really use as a foundation. I think one of the things we've seen at Leadership North Carolina that's so helpful is providing leaders a space to develop those relationships with folks from a very diverse set of backgrounds all across North Carolina. It's certainly not unique to North Carolina, but that has a really beneficial role in developing the types of conversations that we'd like to see a lot of our, perhaps even our elected officials model.
So you're really talking about trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, all right. That'll be the last word. We're gonna bring our guest on in just a moment. Before we do that, next week on the show, Dr. Tim Hardy That name may mean something to you in educational circles in South Carolina. He is the president of the South Carolina Technical College System. He will be here. And then also coming up, a very key job at one of the largest healthcare systems in this country. I almost called it Charlotte Memorial Hospital. It used to be called that. Carolina's healthcare system is the largest in the Carolinas and one of the largest in the country. And the new CEO is Gene Woods. He will be our guest coming up as well. Our guest now, though, was seemingly born for this job. A product of rural South Carolina public schools, was president in student government, undergrad and graduate majors in education, was a classroom music teacher, an assistant principal, a member of the South Carolina House for at least 4 different terms, championed education and children's issues during that time, was deputy superintendent of education, was the executive director of the South Carolina Association of School Administrators. Oh, and by the way, she is now the South Carolina Superintendent of Education. We welcome the Honorable Molly Spearman. Madam Superintendent, welcome back.
Thank you, Chris. Sounds like I should be 90 years old.
Good thing you've got energy.
Yeah.
Your Honor, so, you know, I was going to ask you a question about education, how you fight for dollars. But I want to ask you, coming out of the discussion that we just had with Brian and Ted, when you try to build trust against someone that is opposed to what you just fervently stand for, how do you find that place of trust to disagree on some things but really be able to compromise? How do you do it?
Well, it's been a lifetime of building relationships. I've been very fortunate to have been a classroom teacher, but also served in the legislature, known many of the legislators for years, and always tried to be honest with them. And I think there's a respect there. I saw it in a very, very beautiful way just this past few days on the Senate floor, when the Senate was debating the appointment of the state superintendent, which has been debated for over 60 years in South Carolina. Typically partisan, Republicans more for it, Democrats opposed. But I watched those gentlemen and ladies debate that Wednesday afternoon, and the respect and the ability to listen and to bend a little bit and compromise. The bill went through on a 41-0 vote, and I thought I would never see that. So it's amazing. I think there's a climate, a really good climate of trust in South Carolina. Certainly the education community is getting much more respect than we ever have had from the business community, from legislators, and I hope I've had a little bit to do with that in just this lifelong of relationships, but we've got a great atmosphere for change going on in South Carolina.
So thank you for that segue. So when you have to now, transportation clearly one of the hottest things, but State House has talked about that, put a stake in the ground around it. How do you make sure that you respect the transportation needs it, but you don't let off the accelerator when you need the education dollars, or at least the attention given to the education system?
Well, first, I've tried to be very reasonable. Having been a legislator, served on Ways and Means Committee, I really understand the parameters that they're working under. There are a lot of huge needs in our state, so I don't try to come with a request that's completely undoable, and working very closely with legislators to set priorities. So I've told them we need more funding. However, we're trying to do that in stages. We asked for $150 added to our base student costs this year. We've got a real huge need in replacing our school buses. And then the other focus is on data, industry credentials, things that we're working with the business community. So I found, just as you were talking earlier about preparing the workforce, if we have set that as a huge priority, and legislators understand that, the business community understands it. So I'm really optimistic that we're going to get the funding we need because we had to prioritize. And so the chairman of Ways and Means said, you know, we see your needs. You tell me what are the 10 top things that you need this year. So I had to leave out. All of it was very important, but we focused on those areas that are going to help with building the workforce needs. So I'm optimistic.
Yeah. Ted, question?
Yeah, I mean, Molly is a big reason why there's a lot of trust. I mean, her leadership has been very apparent, and there's a lot of trust there amongst the business community as well as legislators. But you talk about workforce, and as I travel the state, the CEOs and business leaders around the state will tell you that's what keeps them up at night is is the fear that at some point they won't have the qualified workforce to do the high-skilled jobs. Y'all put a lot of focus on CATE, career and technology education. Talk about some of the things that you see as kind of groundbreaking there from our perspective there in the Powell Matter State.
The CATE programs are growing. The legislature too, it keeps me up at night to how can we give the opportunities for all of our students in South Carolina to be prepared for those great jobs and careers that we have here in the area. Many of our students have the opportunities, but we have some who don't. So we went to the legislature last year and asked them to help us, and they gave us some additional funding for industry credentials. We're helping students pay for their apprenticeship programs, for their industry credentials. We're making CATE programs part of how we'll evaluate schools on the new accountability system. So all of those things will bring incentives for students to participate. And we know if we can get a student in a CATE program, in fact, we had over 10,000 CATE completers last year in South Carolina. That means they've taken 4 courses. And if they do that, there's a 97% graduation rate, as well as then those students can walk across the stage, get their diploma, and right into a job, but generally they take some other technical college program. So getting those students involved with that hands-on work-based learning is tremendously important now, and it makes for a better graduate, happy parents.
Just a quick follow-up, but is that an expensive program? If you get that kind of result, why wouldn't you push more into it?
Absolutely. Some are expensive, yes. When you put a mechatronics program in, it's very expensive. We're looking at, and the legislature appropriated additional funding last year to help us. I'm challenging, I just met with our superintendents yesterday, and I'm challenging them, particularly those in the smaller rural areas where we can't put a mechatronics program in at every high school. We've got to think out of the box and get past those imaginary district lines and work more regionally. So giving those opportunities to every student is a challenge, it's expensive, but we're going to be calling on our business community friends to help out too, because I really believe some of those businesses will, and they already do, help with the equipment and providing the instructors.
Sorry, Brian, I jumped ahead of you here in line.
No problem at all. Superintendent Spearman was interested too. You've got a tremendously unique vantage point. You know, having served in the classroom, served in elective office in the legislative area, and then now in your role as Secretary of Education. What are several of the things that you are most excited about sharing with, whether it be parents or legislators or students? Opportunities to kind of demonstrate leadership from your vantage point and your experience.
Well, our new profile of the 21st century graduate, and that's what we're working toward, a student who not only has the content knowledge, but that they have the characteristics and skills, and certainly those are leadership skills. How do you work together? How do you collaborate? So in our new accountability system, our schools will be evaluated not just on how well students do on multiple tests, not just one test anymore, but multiple measures, but also on what kind of programs are they having in their schools to allow students to build their leadership abilities. So I'm really, really happy about that. And another one that I'll mention that's growing, and South Carolina really has been a leader in this, is our apprenticeship programs. Getting students out, using what they know into the workforce, on an industry floor, in a mom and pop business, where they can gain those skills, show that they know how to show up to work on time. And that is growing tremendously. We have some 8,000 students involved in apprenticeships now, and it's booming. So allowing students to do more than just sit in the classroom builds that whole well-prepared graduate.
Ted?
You know, we talk about seat time in education.
Yeah.
You talk about seat time. I know you've been really innovative in how do we get away from that seat time to a competency-based performance? Talk a little bit about.
Well, we're growing, and we actually are dropping a bill this week in the South Carolina legislature on a new diploma idea. We'll still have the one high school diploma. We want to keep it where that quality and recognition is there for everyone. But we're looking at building pathways, personalized pathways to that diploma, where students, when they graduate, will have distinction, seals of distinction to show what areas they've worked in. And I think that builds the recognition for them as well as getting them involved. Now, on that way, we're also looking at changing our regulations to allow students to take tests, to show in their performance measures that they already have the skills that they can move quicker through programs. That's part of competency-based. There are many different areas of competency-based, but we're bringing legislation and regulation changes so that that's more accessible to all students in South Carolina.
Brian?
You know, again, you've got such a unique vantage point, and you know, serving in the legislative branch and now as Secretary of Education, I was curious too of, you know, being in that election cycle, whether it's 2 years or 4 years, is a unique space to be in. But so much of what you're focused on is 8, 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Right.
What are you absolutely focused on now that may not reap benefits for, say, maybe 20 years?
Right. Well, to be quite honest with you, when I came into the Department of Education, there were a lot of things that needed to be changed and improved. I had to go to the legislature to seek some funding. We did not have enough people at the agency to do all the work that needed to be done, and I was able to go, and the legislature trusted me on that, and we've been hiring some folks. We're moving our focus to work out in the rural areas. Most of the larger districts in the state, you know, they have expertise, they can move forward, but there are areas that don't have that expertise, and we need to be that support system for them. So that has taken at least 2 years, and here I am halfway through my term. So we're rolling out the project I mentioned earlier, the diploma pathways, new accountability systems. So I'm excited about all that. That makes me want to run again because you're right, it's going to take at least those 4 years to get it all rolling, and then I want to reap the benefits of some of it and see it in place. And it's another reason why, after going through the election, I'll tell you, I'm in favor of appointing the state superintendent now than an election. I just started trying to raise the funds to run a statewide campaign. Is so expensive. So I do support that legislation, and it looks like it may move through and be on the ballot in 2018 for the first time in South Carolina.
Ma'am, you've got, you know, you get this kind of the ship moving down the canal, and you get some good momentum, as you talked about. You've got some people hired, you can carry some of this weight. And then comes along something like an immigration ban. How does that kind of reverberate through not just teachers and the administrative side, but then now you've got students that are ESL students or something else.
Yeah.
How does this immigration uncertainty play out?
Well, it's made it difficult for teachers. I think teachers are very, very special people. Educators are very, very special people, and they're there because hopefully, number one, they love the children and they want to see all children succeed. So there's some anxiety, some nervousness, but I think when I would say that teachers are doing what they need to be doing every day in that classroom, loving and respecting all children and helping them expand their knowledge and build. So it does build some anxiety. My message to them, though, is, you know, just do your job. Do your job every day, and the higher ups and the higher beings will take care of those policies, and we just have to make sure that we're caring and really giving to those children what they deserve every day, whether they're born American citizens, where they've come here as immigrants. We do have a very large Hispanic population in South Carolina now, but it's amazing the many different languages that are spoken in our schools. Even out in a rural area, you'll have 8 to 10 different languages may be spoken. So it is something that those teachers face every day.
We've got less than a minute left. Sorry, Ted, I'm going to ask just a last question here. The South Carolina Supreme Court ruled that the impoverished schools in South Carolina were basically not getting their fair share, but there's no teeth, there's no enforcement in this. In about 30 seconds, how does the school system comply to what the ruling in South Carolina Supreme Court
We're
was?
working very hard. In fact, we just let proposal of folks who are working on an efficiency study. One of the first things that's happened, we have a group that's going into each of the plaintiff districts, looking at their operations, looking at their facilities, what do they need, recommendations on how they can collaborate, possibly consolidate. That report should be out in just a few months.
Okay.
That will be the first step, and I know the legislature is going to come behind it with some funding.
Well, thank you, because that's about as much as anyone has been able to do on this, so I hope the momentum continues. Your Honor, welcome. Good to have you. Please come back.
Thank you.
Okay. Brian, good to see you.
Good to be with
Come
you.
on back. We'd love to have you. Ted can't be here all the time, but always like to have you,
Thank
Ted,
you.
so good to see you. Thank you for watching us. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. BlueCross and BlueShield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. NOVANT Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. BlueCross BlueShield of South Carolina. Please visit us at southcarolinablues.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.org.